Okay, so the first topic we wanted to discuss today is a juicy one, and it's even juicier, guys, because it involves two previous sponsors of this very show, Deal and Rippling. So this is about corporate espionage. Over the last 24 hours at the time of recording, there was a story that broke where Rippling, the HR tech company, is suing Deal, another HR tech company, for corporate espionage. So what they allege is that Deal actually placed employees inside Rippling and used them to extract competitive intelligence from them. And this story has it all. They set up a honeypot and did a bunch of stuff to basically catch this person. Slack is basically the key bit of evidence where this person inside Rippling was searching for Deal dozens of times a day and extracting information, discussions about Deal, about competitive situations and so on. And I think it's fascinating. Both these companies are doing something pretty similar. They're both growing at a pretty similar pace, which is fast. I believe Rippling's valued at $13 billion and Deal at $12 billion. So it's neck and neck. And, I just think it's a really interesting story. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit, folks, about the general question of corporate espionage, because actually another story also broke, which is that Flexport is accusing some of its former employees of stealing its source code and other IP to create a rival startup. And, I think one question maybe, I know we've talked before about not worrying too much about people stealing your stuff when you're building a startup, because really you don't even have a right to exist yet. But at a certain point, that changes. So what are our takes on this?
Speaks a little bit to the kind of intense pressure from the market, VCs, stakeholders for, unrivaled hyper growth. It's sort of like win at all costs, including breaking the law and stealing data, maybe. Corporate espionage has been around for forever, right?
Hmm.
But it's now a high stakes game of Slack search, which, Slack makes it a lot easier, especially if you're getting notifications about big new clients and clients churning and what have you. And yeah, and there's a lot of pressure on these companies, especially in these hype cycles, to win the day. In the end of the day, it's going to be more costly for them than any advantage they would have gotten because it's just going to crater their brand and crater their leadership.
To me, it really speaks to is the fact that these tools that we use every single day are really the medium is actually, you know, such a part of the way that these companies are built now. And, they're not these employees are not going and having a backroom conversation, debriefing at the end of the day on what they talked about. They're just going on Slack. And you have to know that these communications in the medium that you're using, this information is, I don't want to say it's being tracked, but it is being tracked, like there's history. It's, you can see all of these things. And I think it is pretty interesting to see like Slack DMs as evidence in a corporate lawsuit is definitely wild. It, kind of feels like a scene of a modern tech succession scene or something like that. It's pretty shocking to think that a company would actually place a mole, if that is the case, at another company, because, those types of things, you just can't imagine that wouldn't get found out with this medium. That's kind of my point. It's not like these things are not trackable or traceable. You
It's
can
mm.
actually go and see what was said. And I wonder, if that's that kind of intent to go and do it, you're either going in with eyes wide open where you're like, okay, if we get caught, we still got all of this information, or to think that you actually wouldn't get caught is pretty shocking.
Funny you should say that, Ellie, because ultimately I actually wonder why you think that it's impossible to imagine that you couldn't get caught. What this makes me wonder is, for every case that is discovered, how many cases of corporate espionage have not been discovered and flown right under the radar? Most companies I've worked for, maybe they log all this stuff, but they don't have the resources to actually look through all these logs and alert for suspicious behavior. And so I actually wonder if corporate espionage is much more widespread than one might imagine.
I'm sure that it might be. I wouldn't say it probably is. It very well could be, but I think the thing is about the technologies that we have today. AI allows you to process massive amounts of unstructured data in a way that we've never been able to do before, and at
Mm.
a rate that we've never been able to do before. I don't know if those kinds of tools were used in actually uncovering this. It's hard to know. There's pretty interesting like timing, in terms of finding it out. But because that is true, that it's not like, maybe it's not like those things weren't happening, but maybe someone wasn't looking for it, or we didn't have the
Mm.
resources, to be actually, scraping through. But AI doesn't sleep. AI constantly has the resources to do that. So it is pretty interesting. And I think it is something that we'll probably talk about later in the show is sort of how employees actually feel about their messages being used, or tracked or read, or, by models and things like that.
This speaks to the continued undermining of the Silicon Valley culture. You know, Slack is a tool that kind of represents and embodies this idea of open communication, full transparency, peer-to-peer, break down silos, casualness. And then it was used against the company to be able to mine data about competitors and CRM events and so on. The liberalism and optimism of Silicon Valley tech, that we're here to change the world, make a dent in the universe, we're the good guys, seems to be getting diminished in recent, let's call it months, if not years. And it's now more about like, win, dominate, crush, destroy, take over the country. I know certainly I've noticed a palpable shift in this cycle in Silicon Valley from being more about social and authenticity and open, which is like the last cycle of social tools, to now it's like pound Jolt Cola until until 2 a.m. and write algorithms. Like there's no time to fuck around. And so it does speak to this kind of erosion of the idealism of some of these cultural trends, I think.
I don't know if I'd agree with you on maybe on the erosion part, but I think there's always been a tension between the underlying competitive nature of Silicon Valley and the perhaps performative, perhaps integral and true, but um, social liberalism and do-gooder ethos. And I think that the reality is that when you're building these types of massive tech companies, there is a ruthless competitive nature. And we've seen it in so many of the organizations that have come out of Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the world. And I don't think that's new. It might just be coming up in different ways today.
Well, Google's not having any more meetings about safe spaces, is what I'm saying. They're no longer tolerating even the performative stuff, right? The leaders are no longer pretending to be, or I don't know if they were pretending, but they're no longer like Democratic donors. They're now on stage with Trump. There's no and now this sort of openness is being weaponized. Now, or you can jump in any chat and you can talk to anyone, and now it's like maybe we don't want everybody seeing everything.
Well, that to me is actually the interesting thing that I'd love to discuss a bit, which is that the culture of tech companies, and one that I strongly espouse, is one of internal openness, right? That the way you build a fast-growing tech company, the way you stay aligned, the way you share context, is by having things open by default, so that employees can understand the broad context of what's happening and move faster. Now, I think the question here is, does the risk of corporate espionage or even state espionage potentially obviate that? Does that mean we should start locking things down more as founders? Or do we say, I guess maybe the question I would ask is, how much has Rippling really been hurt by this? Would they have done things differently? Will they be doing things differently in the future, knowing now that there are competitors who are trying to steal information from them?
That's a good concrete example. Like I work at a startup, advise a startup that has Microsoft tools, and it's maddening, absolutely maddening, because it's all closed by default. It's all, corporate closed policy. And so to share a document, the links expire and you have to recopy them and you have to set certain settings, and everything is just a nightmare. And Google is open by default. Google Docs, Google Workspaces, right? And so it borrows more from that Silicon Valley kind of mind space. So yeah, you're this kind of default open of the culture, of the tools, of the data policies is what I'm referring to. And it feels like there is a number of like death by a thousand cuts for this kind of these default cultural positions that are eroding away. And this feels like a good excuse to erode this openness, cultural value.
I think that the inherent values within individuals still exist just because there's pressure from outside forces that is right now in this particular moment making companies like Google not have those open space conversations. We know that that's coming from outside pressure. But I think that the ambition and the drive of the values of the individuals inside the organization are probably still the same. And I'm sure there are many people who do care about it, and I'm sure there are many people who don't. And that's fine. People have different values that drive them. I don't think, Yanav, to your question about rippling, two employees stole our IP and started a competitor is not an outside unusual story. Like, this is not something that this is not unheard of, and this is not a new story. I think that if you're a founder, at what point do you protect IP versus accept that talent moves fast is a pretty classic question. And I think the idea, so thus far, there's different ways to go about it. Some try to protect it. Some, take that closed systems approach and the maybe combative approach. And others are like, cool, we're going to innovate faster. We're going to keep moving, and we're going to be open about it. And I think that these are reflective of different mindsets of individuals and there's examples on both sides of success, right? And that's okay. I do think that the open nature of building internally is really critical. I believe that that's really critical to success in organizations, and especially as an early stage investor. And I also think that as you grow as a company, today employees are under, I believe that people are under no illusion. Like, there's Slack messages and their information that they're discussing internally in the organization. You have to understand and know that that's the data and belongs to the company, right? And I think that if you are having open conversations internally, it should be productive stuff. It should be good stuff. It should be ethical stuff. And unless you are acting unethical and unless you are doing something wrong, you should have nothing to worry about. Personally, that's what I believe.